Canada moved fast on Tuesday, rejecting Donald Trump's four-page ultimatum within 4 hours after the U.S. president demanded American terms for a sweeping energy reset that would have effectively split the two countries' $735 billion energy relationship. Prime Minister Mark Carney's response was immediate and blunt, signaling that Ottawa was not going to negotiate under pressure. The ultimatum, described by sources familiar with the exchange as a demand for a new framework on energy flows, pricing, and cross-border control, landed in Ottawa as a high-stakes test of leverage. Trump's side framed the proposal as a deal, but Canadian officials treated it as a forced choice: accept U.S. terms or face a rupture in one of North America's most important energy ties. Carney's rejection came before the ink had time to dry on the White House's talking points. According to officials briefed on the discussions, Ottawa concluded that the document was less a negotiation than a political shove, with Washington trying to rewrite the rules from the top down. Canada's answer was not to stall, but to shut the door quickly and publicly enough to make the point stick. That speed mattered. In diplomatic terms, a 4-hour turnaround is not hesitation. It is a signal that the other side has already done the math and decided the offer is not worth entertaining. Canadian officials appear to have judged that the ultimatum exposed Washington's urgency more than its strength, especially given the scale of the energy relationship at stake. The stakes are enormous because the Canada-US energy corridor is not a side issue, but a core piece of North American supply, investment, and industrial planning. A breakup on American terms would have touched pipelines, power trade, refining, and contracts across both countries, with consequences far beyond the headline number. That is exactly why Ottawa's refusal landed as more than a diplomatic no. It was a refusal to let Trump set the frame. For Carney, the move also reinforced a broader message: Canada is not waiting to be cornered into a reaction. Officials in Ottawa have been signaling for weeks that they intend to meet Trump's pressure with speed, discipline, and a clear line on sovereignty. In this case, the response was simple and immediate, and it made one thing clear: the leverage was never where Trump thought it was. Canada was staring straight at an one-point energy power grab on Tuesday, and the fine print made one thing obvious: Washington was not offering a partnership. It was trying to write the rule book for North American supply. The document, described by officials familiar with the talks, went far beyond crude oil. It reportedly pushed for discounted barrels, tighter U.S. influence over pipeline routing, and first refusal rights that would let American buyers get first dibs before Canadian customers or other export markets. That structure is why Canadian officials viewed the ultimatum as a sovereignty issue, not a pricing dispute. The pressure did not stop at oil. The 11 provisions reportedly reached into gas, electricity, nuclear fuel, hydrogen, and critical minerals, signaling that Trump's team was not just targeting one commodity, but trying to put its hands on the full entire energy stack. That matters because each of those sectors sits at a different point in Canada's industrial base, and together they power everything from heating and manufacturing to grid stability and future clean tech investment. For Ottawa, the message was simple: if the U.S. could dictate terms across multiple sectors at once, then Canada would be left negotiating from the back seat. That is why the response from Carney's government was so fast and is so flat. Officials saw a blueprint for dependency, not a deal, and they were not interested in turning Canada into a captive supplier, with Washington holding the receipt. One of the most sensitive pieces was the push around pipeline control. Any effort to give U.S. actors more say over how Canadian oil moves south would have raised immediate questions about who actually controls the infrastructure that carries the country's exports. Add first refusal rights on top of that, and the result would have been a system where Canada could produce the energy but lose meaningful control over where the value landed. The same logic applied to gas and power trade. Cross-border electricity flows and gas exports are already deeply integrated, but the ultimatum appeared to seek a bigger U.S. hand in how those flows are priced and prioritized. That is the part Canadian officials were not going to swallow, because once control shifts from market access to political permission, the relationship stops looking bilateral and starts looking lopsided. The nuclear fuel and hydrogen provisions added another layer of reach. Nuclear fuel is tied to long-term grid planning and industrial reliability, while hydrogen is still an emerging market with major strategic upside for both countries. By trying to fold those sectors into the same framework, Trump's team appeared to be aiming not just at today's exports, but at the next decade of energy competition. Critical minerals were the final tell. Those materials are central to batteries, defense systems, and advanced manufacturing, which makes them one of the most contested resources in the global economy. For Canada, any U.S. attempt to lock in preferential access would have looked like a bid to preempt future leverage before Ottawa could fully monetize its own resource base. Seen together, the 11 provisions were not a menu of isolated pests. They were a coordinated attempt to reach across Canada's energy and industrial future, from traditional fuels to the materials that will shape the next wave of electrification. Canada had already quietly built its escape route. Canada took the stage in Calgary on Thursday, with Prime Minister Mark Carney standing beside the leaders of the country's 6 largest energy companies and signaling that Ottawa, not Washington, would decide how Canada's resources are sold. The message landed as markets and analysts read President Donald Trump's deadline as a sign the U.S. hand was weakening, not strengthening. Carney's appearance was not a photo op in the usual political sense. It was a public show of alignment between the federal government and the executives who control much of Canada's oil, gas, and export infrastructure, a signal that Ottawa is treating energy policy as a sovereignty issue, not a bargaining chip. In plain terms, Canada was not waiting around for Trump's clock to run out. Carney used Calgary, the center of Canada's energy economy, to project control over the country's most strategic sector. By standing with the 6 biggest CEOs, he made clear that the federal government was not isolated and that the industry itself was prepared to back a firmer line against U.S. demands. The optics were deliberate, and they were aimed at one audience in particular: anyone in Washington betting that Canada would blink first. That bet now looks shakier. Analysts tracking the talk said the deadline itself may have done damage to Trump's position by exposing how much the U.S. needed a result and how little room it had to escalate without hurting its own energy market. When the side setting the deadline looks more anxious than the side receiving it, the leverage story starts to flip. The reaction in Calgary also underscored a basic political reality. Canada has more room to organize a coordinated response than Trump's team appears to have assumed. Ottawa can lean on provincial governments, producers, regulators, and export policy all at once, which gives Carney a broader toolkit than a simple yes or no answer. That is the part Trump's team seems to have misread, and it is why the deadline is now being treated as a pressure test that Canada may be winning. For the energy executives on stage, the stakes were practical as much as political. They are managing long-term contracts, capital spending, and cross-border flows that cannot be rewritten by one ultimatum without creating chaos in pricing and investment. In that sense, Carney's message was also a warning to markets. Canada intends to keep control of the system that keeps the lights on and the barrels moving. The broader read from traders was equally blunt. A deadline can look powerful on paper, but if it does not produce immediate compliance, it can turn into a countdown that weakens the issuer instead of the target. That is the current problem for Trump, whose move is increasingly being seen as a reaction to Canada's refusal to play along, not proof that Washington has the upper hand. Carney's Calgary appearance also gave Ottawa a way to frame the dispute as national management rather than retaliation. Instead of matching Trump's language blow for blow, Canada is presenting itself as the adult in the room, steady, coordinated, and unwilling to let a foreign deadline dictate domestic energy policy. The contrast is doing political work because it makes Trump's approach look impulsive while making Canada look prepared. Wall Street has not fully caught up to that shift yet, but the signals are there. Canada just turned Warren Buffett's warning into a market signal. And the message from Calgary was plain. If Washington keeps squeezing, the North American energy machine starts leaking in real time. Buffett's latest comments on the dispute were read by traders as more than a casual opinion from one of the most closely watched investors in the world. According to market analysts, his framing of the standoff amounted to an admission that the U.S. economy is not insulated from Canadian energy flows, refinery supply, or cross-border pricing. In other words, the ultimatum was supposed to project strength, but it also exposed how dependent the U.S. still is on a system it does not fully control. That is where the refinery risk comes in. And it is not theoretical. U.S. Gulf Coast and Midwest refineries are built around a crude mix that includes heavy Canadian barrels, and even a short disruption can force buyers to scramble for replacements. At higher prices, industry sources have long warned that when Canadian supply gets politicized, the pain does not stay on paper. It shows up in crack spreads, transport costs, and margins almost immediately. The Keystone issue adds another layer of pressure, because the pipeline remains one of the clearest symbols of how fragile the bilateral energy balance really is. Any renewed political fight around Keystone does not just affect one line on a map. It threatens a major export route, complicates investment decisions, and sends a warning to lenders that the cross-border relationship is no longer a stable assumption. For Canada, that becomes leverage. For Trump, it becomes a self-inflicted risk. Ottawa's broader play is diversification, and that is what makes this round different. Canada has spent years expanding export options, deepening ties with Asia and Europe, and reducing the idea that the U.S. market is the only game in town. The more Canada can redirect barrels, gas, and capital toward alternative buyers, the less effective Washington's pressure campaign becomes, because the threat of punishment stops looking like a one-way street. That shift is already being priced in. Traders are watching not just the headline fight, but the probability that Canada responds by hardening contract terms, slowing optional volumes, or accelerating non-U.S. deals that weaken American buying power. The market does not need a formal breakdown to react. It only needs the sense that the old assumptions are gone. Once that happens, the repricing can be fast, broad, and ugly. Buffett's role in the story matters because he is not some fringe commentator throwing rocks from the sidelines. When an investor of that scale effectively says the U.S. cannot treat Canadian energy as disposable, he is putting a number on a political problem. That is why the ultimatum now looks less like a show of force and more like a confession. Washington needs the system to keep working, and Canada knows it. For Canada, that is the advantage. Ottawa is not just rejecting Trump's terms. It is showing it can absorb the pressure, redirect the flows, and make the cost of escalation land back on the U.S. side of the border. For Trump, the response is starting to look like a reflexive counterpunch against a partner that already understands the leverage, and then the North American system starts failing in real time. Canada just turned Trump's energy ultimatum into an American emergency as Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine braced for supply stress. LNG projects stalled, Brent crude jumped, and Republicans, the American Petroleum Institute, and oil executives pushed back hard on the White House line. The fallout hit first in New England, where state officials and utility planners began treating the dispute as a real-world supply threat rather than a political stunt. That is where the political backlash exploded. Republicans in energy-heavy states began warning that the White House was risking jobs, refinery margins, and consumer prices for a fight that looked increasingly self-defeating. Several lawmakers argued that Trump was not punishing Canada so much as exposing how much the U.S. still needs Canadian supply, Canadian processing, and Canadian cooperation to keep domestic fuel markets stable. The American Petroleum Institute also moved quickly, signaling that the industry was not buying the spin. API-aligned voices said the administration's approach could chill investment, distort pricing, and create unnecessary uncertainty for refiners already dealing with thin margins and volatile feedstock costs. Oil executives were even blunter in private. According to people familiar with the conversations, if the point was to show strength, the result was a market that started asking whether Washington understood the system it was trying to bully. For refiners, the problem is immediate and mechanical. Many U.S. facilities are configured around crude slates that include Canadian barrels, especially heavier grades that are not easy to replace on short notice without paying more. If those flows get interrupted or politicized, operators face higher replacement costs, more complicated logistics, and tighter crack spreads, which means the damage lands not in theory, but in earnings and pump prices. The LNG slowdown added another layer of pressure because it signaled that capital was beginning to hesitate. Developers do not need a formal ban to freeze a project. They only need a credible sense that the policy environment has become unstable enough to threaten financing, offtake agreements, or cross-border approvals. That is why the reaction from investors was so sharp. Trump's posture made the U.S. look less like a reliable energy market and more like a place where one political feud can jam the pipeline. Meanwhile, Canada's position only hardened. Ottawa did not need to announce a dramatic countermeasure to gain leverage. The market was already doing part of that work by repricing risk, slowing deals, and forcing U.S. stakeholders to confront the cost of escalation. The longer the standoff drags on, the more Canada looks like the side with options, while Washington looks like the side trying to gaslight the market into pretending supply chains are optional. That is why the revolt matters. It is not just public criticism, it is a coalition of governors, senators, trade groups, and executives signaling that Trump's policy is now colliding with the people who actually keep fuel moving. And as the pressure widened across the Northeast, the Gulf Coast, and Wall Street, Trump's response only deepened the collapse. Canada is walking away with the leverage, and Washington is left explaining why trust just became the most valuable energy asset in North America. What looked like a hardline trade fight has instead exposed a deeper reality. The country with the steadier rules, cleaner signals, and more credible partnerships is the one setting the pace. By late week, that shift was visible well beyond the political noise. Traders, utilities, and project developers were no longer asking whether the dispute was symbolic. They were asking whether the U.S. had just made itself a riskier place to do business. In energy markets, that question is brutal, because capital does not care about chest thumping. It cares about whether contracts hold, approvals move, and governments stop gaslighting the supply chain. That is where Canada's advantage hardened. Ottawa did not need to match Trump's volume to win the moment. It only needed to look more predictable than the White House in a sector built on multi-year financing, cross-border processing, and long-term offtake deals. Predictability is power, and Canada has been the side acting like it understands the assignment. The result is a quiet but sharp repricing of North American energy politics. Canadian producers still have access to U.S. demand. U.S. refineries still need Canadian feedstock, and U.S. households still feel the cost when policy gains hit the market. But the balance of control is shifting because Canada can diversify, delay, and negotiate from a position of steady supply, while Washington is the one absorbing. The economic slapback, that is also why the fallout is larger than one dispute. Once investors begin treating political interference as a real operating hazard, the damage spreads into financing, insurance, shipping, and expansion plans. A project does not have to be canceled to be hurt. It only has to be questioned. And right now, the message from the market is that Canada looks like the reliable partner, while the U.S. looks like the country trying to turn its own energy system into a reality show. For American policymakers, the price is not just higher crude or slower projects, it is credibility. The U.S. still has scale, infrastructure, and demand, but those advantages matter less when counterparties start wondering whether a future administration will rewrite the rules on a whim. That is the part Trump's team keeps missing. In energy, trust is not a soft issue. It is the asset that keeps everything else moving. Canada, meanwhile, has turned restraint into leverage by refusing to panic and by letting the market register the consequences of escalation. It has forced the U.S. to confront the real cost of its own tactics. The optics are ugly for Washington. The country that tried to dominate the relationship is now the one paying for the uncertainty it created. So the bigger story is not steel, not pipelines, and not even tariffs. It is that Canada has shown it can outlast the bluff, outmaneuver the pressure, and let American stakeholders do the complaining for it. Trump's policy has not broken Canada's position, it has clarified it. This is not a trade dispute anymore.